Hello everyone, welcome to another AnalyticaHP debate. Today's motion will be on whether foreign military intervention in a country's internal affairs is a good thing. So, arguing for foreign intervention will be Archie, and arguing against foreign military intervention will be Joseph. So, let's have an opening statement from Archie.
In the 1990s, Milosevic became the most powerful person in Yugoslavia and the leader of Serbia. This was coinciding with the breakup of the country. Nations inside Yugoslavia were starting to sign treaties, etc., allowing them to leave the Union of Yugoslavia. Milosevic started committing genocides and blatant human rights abuses such as torture around his country in order to try and stop this from happening in the war that ensued between Croatia and Serbia mainly in the country over the next few years. Now, NATO's forces, led by the United Kingdom and the US in this case, sent in bomber planes which bombed the Serbian bombers and forces and allowed them to stop millions of people, innocent people, citizens, from being killed in mass genocides by Milosevic. Now, that's only one example that I've given you, but I could give you many, many more. And what this shows us is that when other countries that are stable interfere in order to stop mass loss of life, it can often result in a very good thing from happening. Because now the former Yugoslavia is on the repair, and millions more people are alive, and millions more people who wouldn't have been alive because their mothers or grandmothers would have been killed by Milosevic's forces are now alive and going to schools in Serbia or Croatia or any of the other former Yugoslavian states. Now the main thing here is about the main area around this debate, which is, I think, going to be Joseph's key point, which is about sovereignty and why should one country have the power or the ability to interfere in another, and what gives them that status over another country. Now, this is exactly why we have international corporations and international organizations. And the reason we have them is to avoid conflict by talking and debating issues. And if international organizations deem it necessary or deem it okay for a country's forces to interfere in another, then it means that that country has been then it means that the international status, which arguably exists over another country, has granted another country permission to go and interfere in their internal affairs. And by interfering in internal affairs here, we do not mean meddling around in elections, because that's undemocratic and unlawful. We mean preventing mass loss of life. And while I've already said this, I want to stress this point again, because loss of life is more important than a government's sovereignty, especially if that government is a dictatorship, and a particularly brutal dictatorship, such as the one which Milosevic commanded in Yugoslavia. Now that brings me on to my next point quite nicely, which is about dictators. And dictators are commonly, and this is the trend which exists worldwide, obsessed with their own power and maintaining their power over the welfare of their citizens. And this will often result in genocides happening in the country to try and quench resistance movements. And that is a clear violation of international law, apart from anything else. And that gives in my opinion, and this argument is based upon the fact that if a country commits a mass genocide or does a clear violation of international law, then another country, then that gives another country the right. And because people need to be protected against a military, because people can't protect themselves against the military. And if their own country isn't going to defend them, then someone does need to defend them. And if that someone is another country, then so be it. That needs to happen, because it is important. It is really important that those people's lives and their rights are protected. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Archie. Could Joseph please make his opening statement and respond to some of Archie's points?
Thank you, Archie, for that opening statement. I'm actually glad you mentioned international cooperation and treaties, because if you look at the Kellogg-Briand Pact, signed sometime after before the Second World War, you can clearly see that most modern countries, including NATO members, European nations, signed this pact, which effectively outlaws war in all cases but self-defense. Therefore, by invading another country as such, by interfering in their military affairs, you are committing a serious breach of international law. This has been reinforced by the United Nations declarations of when war is legal. This has also been reinforced by such things as the Geneva Conventions and such other things. So yes, my second point rests on the idea that military interventions are fundamentally bad. You talk about there being many good ones, but even your strongest point, the one that you chose to mention, Yugoslavia has left decades of turmoil, ruined states, and bitter rivalry between the southern Slavs of Eastern Europe. For instance, the country of Kosovo is only half recognized, and there is still regularly riots, street fights, and border wars between Serbia and Kosovo, with Serbia claiming Kosovo. Yes. Apart from that, you look at Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Chad, with the joint French-American intervention. The failed interventions hugely exceed the successful interventions, if these successful interventions can even be called successful. So, next, if we look at the case of Syria, the US intervention there and subsequent pullout has left the country in a horrendous state. But the weakest thing about these interventions is that they are usually done by democratic countries with large opposing parties, which means that on the simple whim of an election, the party can change its policy, stop intervening, and therefore leave that country in even more of a shambles than it was before. You see this most clearly with Donald Trump and the United States pull out of Syria, which left their Kurdish allies, who had been backed and reinforced by the previous Obama administration, isolated and currently being invaded by more than 3 separate entities. Turkey, the Islamic State, Syria, the Syrian rebels. They are in a horrible situation at the moment. And this is because the US intervened, which caused them to enter the war and then pulled out. This simple democratic whim means that democratic nations, I'm not saying that dictatorships are better. Obviously, dictatorships shouldn't intervene either. I'm saying that no country should intervene. But if a democracy is to intervene, this quick changing politics means that there is no time in a term to bring around successful reform and change in the country. It is very unusual for wars to last less time than the term of a president or prime minister of a country. Therefore, we see that when democratic states intervene in war, the outcome is usually a dedicated intervention, which of course leads to, as I have explained, many problems, and then a hasty and scurried removal of troops from that country, which leads to even more shambles, a power vacuum, which we see in the Iraq pullout, which was too early and should not have happened yet. Iraq needed more time to stabilize with coalition forces, even though by then it had already been a disaster. Yeah, even though by then it had already been a disaster, as I have said. Iraq was left even weaker by the pullout, and the subsequent power vacuum allowed terrorist groups to take power across the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joseph. We've finished with the opening statements now, so Archie would like to count some of his points.
Thank you, Yazoo. So Joseph's first point was about how interfering in other countries is a breach of international law. Now, I think that Joseph has actually gotten this wrong because in doing this, countries are not going to war for a personal gain, which is what I think that agreement was focusing on. But even then, there are defensive motivations for these foreign interventions. And the first one of them is that you are defending people from mass genocides and from torture. And that is very important. That is more, and that is just as important as defending your own country. Because if one country won't defend their own people, as I said in my opening statement, then it is the responsibility of an international organization or an international entity, and international entities can be their own country, to defend people. And the other way that in which countries are defending is that they are defending a value. They are defending values that were created in agreements such as the Bretton Woods Agreement and other agreements such as that which is Joseph has mentioned. And they are defending these values which are based upon freedom and human rights agreements and other things like this, which are very important in ensuring that dictatorships and even democracies around the world don't abuse people in their own countries, and they don't commit these mass genocides. So Joseph's second point was about how foreign intervention creates country rivalries, and he used the same example as I did in my opening statement as Yugoslavia, and the main one he touched on was Serbia with Kosovo. And I'd just like to simply say that it wasn't NATO's intervention that caused these rivalries. These rivalries already existed. Serbia already claimed Kosovo, and Kosovo refused to be a part of Serbia. These rivalries already existed. It was Yugoslavia was still a country when there were terrorist attacks by Croatian groups in Serbia, Serbian groups in Croatia, Serbian groups in Kosovo, and vice versa, so on and so on. So actually, Joseph's incorrect on that front. And his third point was about how there are more unsuccessful United States interventions than successful interventions. Now, I don't know the exact number, and if that is true, then that does not change the principle of that is that foreign intervention should be allowed, should be a thing which is permitted in the world. Because even if the United States has intervened unsuccessfully in the last few years, that does not change the fact that people's lives matter, and that if a country won't protect their own people's lives, then another country needs to. And just because one country hasn't done a very good job of that over the last few years while they've been the superpower in the world, it doesn't mean that we should stop that altogether. Rather, that is a different debate about whether or not the United States is a good superpower in the world. And then your last point was that it is usually a democracy which interferes, and that means that they can leave suddenly with a re-election. Now, I think that again, that doesn't change the point, which is that there is a fundamental responsibility to defend people's lives. And I think that any leader that comes to power who realizes that is not going to withdraw their troops. They're going to maintain their responsibility, and I think that this is another matter about the way in which international intervention is done. And I'm defending international intervention as a concept here. And again, and the most common example of this in nowadays is Donald Trump, because he's withdrawn all of his troops from most of his troops from the Middle East and in places like that. And I think that for a start, Donald Trump is very much an exception to the common global leader. And I also think that that he has actually broken his responsibility there. He's gone against his responsibility that he had in and definitely the US and the UK's invasion of Iraq was not a good thing. But the two countries now have a responsibility to rebuild Iraq, and I think that if they deny that responsibility, then I think that is another matter rather than about how good foreign intervention is, because I'm defending that as a concept. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Archie. Interesting points there. Would Joseph like to respond to some of them?
Thank you very much, Yazoo. I'd like to start by responding to his point that he is defending the people. But the Kellogg Briand Pact and all these pacts say that it is only when it is necessary that military force must be used. And in this case, the people can be defended without military force. Diplomatic pressures can be put on the country. We can have sanctions. We can have such other things. In Iran, other religions, minorities are protected and allowed to practice their faith in private because of sanctions. Thanks to sanctions, we have managed to ensure liberty, more liberty in any case, and such in Iran. Why can't we apply this to other countries? Military force is not needed, is wasteful of lives and of money. Next, you talked about how these country rivalries have persisted for thousands of years and will continue to persist for thousands of years, and that's exactly my point. You charged into a country, got thousands of people killed, and when you left, it's exactly the same. They're still rivals. They're still fighting. You've gone in, you've left, and it's still the same. You cannot call that a successful campaign. And next, you say that the US that just because the US has been quite bad at it in recent years doesn't mean we should stop. It's not just the US, and it's not just recently. Since the Vietnam Wars, and even before that, we can see that fighting against a nation ready to employ guerrilla tactics and with fanatic soldiers in a guerrilla war, with them having the home field advantage, is very hard to successfully carry out. In Iraq, the war was difficult. In Afghanistan, the country remains mainly unconquered, and Soviet and American interventions have had no effect on the country at all, apart from making it more violent and bloodier. This shows that it's not just the US. First of all, the French intervention into Chad has been very violent and has left the country in complete disarray. The British intervention into Cameroon in their language war has also basically escalated the language war from a simple street fight between French and English soldiers, French and English people, to a full-scale war between the east and west halves of the country. Finally, you say that politicians don't pull out of countries, that Donald Trump is the exception rather than the rule. And I agree that in most ways, Donald Trump is more of an exception, but that's for another debate. He has pulled out troops from Syria, and all presidents of the United States, all presidents of other countries, do pull out troops. Obama pulled troops out of Nicaragua, and actually that went rather well. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for it, but that's an isolated case. The French President Emmanuel Macron pulled troops out of Chad, which left the country in an even worse state than before. David Cameron pulled his troops out of Iraq and Afghanistan, which caused the power vacuum there. So yes, we see that these changes are terrible. They badly affect countries. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Joseph. So back to Archie.
So again, I'm just going to go through Joseph's points and then counter them with my own. So I just want to first talk about something which we've mentioned now quite a lot, which is about who pulls troops out and about leaders. Now, everyone pulls troops out was basically what Joseph said. And that's true, because someone pulls the troops out at a point, but and when they pull their troops out is the important thing. And if they pull their troops out at a bad time, then they have done a bad job, and that's not debatable. But I think that what we're trying to talk about here is not about whether or not David Cameron pulled his troops out of the Middle East at the right time. It's about whether or not foreign intervention for the correct motivations should be permitted in the world, and and it clearly should, because loss of life is very important to prevent. Now, I'd just like to talk about next his another one of his points, which was about military force is not necessary. He said diplomacy can be used. Now, diplomacy can definitely be used. Now, I'm all for diplomacy being used before military intervention is used. And I think that military intervention should always be a last resort, and then it should never be used if diplomacy has not been used yet. However, in the case of Yugoslavia, which is the one we keep on touching on, foreign intervention had happened. I mean, diplomatic intervention had happened. There were sanctions on Serbia. There are sanctions on lots of countries all around the world, and Russia and Crimea are another example of this. There are countless sanctions on Russia as a country, and on Putin himself, and on Putin's inner core of politicians and businessmen. However, Russia have continued to, keep Crimea. They annexed Crimea with some sanctions on them, and I think that this is another example of how diplomatic intervention doesn't always work. And I think that, I definitely think that this is not a reason to just go to war if you disagree ideologically with another country. It is, but I think that if one country is constantly murdering people and is murdering thousands, if not millions of people, then I think there is a clear reason to interfere with the military in that country, especially if diplomatic sanctions have not been used. And that brings me on to Joseph's next point and my next point, which is about how he said the military force wastes lives, but it saves lives, and it definitely saves more lives than it lost, and then it loses or wastes, because there are less soldiers than there are citizens, and that means that and that's kind of a simple ratio, if you like. And that means that the ratio of soldiers killed, even if you were to kill all of a country's soldiers, it would be often less people dead than with the citizens being killed. And it is very rare for an entire army to be wiped out. And lastly, I'd just like to touch on this point, which is that they are still rivals and still fighting in Yugoslavia, which was the example. So it failed because they have remained rivals. However, it did not fail because the purpose of this intervention was not to try and make amends between Serbia and Kosovo. The point of this intervention was to save millions of lives, which were being taken away by Milosevic. And that was a success. And diplomacy is the thing that it should be used to try and quench rivalries, not military power. But military power can be used, and in many ways should be used almost, if millions of lives are being lost and a country is not doing, and diplomatic interventions and the sanctions have not done anything to stop that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Archie. So we'll just go to Joseph before we move on to closing statements.
So you said that even though election promises and so on, different leaders filling out may make the intervention bad, it does not morally change the status of the intervention. I think it does. Because if we see that because of this, a higher percentage, and even an astronomically high percentage, of interventions fail, then isn't it morally and therefore motivationally bad because it's a higher risk of failure? It's you're taking bigger chances, the stakes are raised, that you have a higher chance of the failure. Therefore, yes, you cannot say that just because the failure of something doesn't tie into whether it's morally good or bad. You cannot say that, especially not in these cases where large amounts of lives are being gambled. You cannot say that. So, secondly, yes, we have put sanctions, but sanctions in the modern world are used more as a way to garner supporters for an election than as an effective measure. We need effective sanctions. Sanctions of the sort that have been delivered on North Korea as to stop it waging as much cyber war on its neighbors as it would have liked to. North Korea is still not fully resolved, of course. But yes, we need better sanctions, not sanctions that slightly do take a tiny bit out of Russia's economy. We need huge, overwhelming sanctions that match the severity of the situation that another country has been invaded by this country. So yes, you say that sanctions are inefficient, but that is because we are misusing sanctions. Simply because of that. If we use sanctions effectively, we would garner very good results. And indeed, this is one of the best ways to reach peace. Next, you said that leading a pullout would lead to peace and prosperity, as there would be a lot less people dead, but you haven't stopped these people from dying. You've just pushed it back 80 years, as I said last time with my points about country rivalries. You're really putting a long-term power vacuum, which for the examples of Iraq has been filled by ISIS, and in countries they've all been filled by large terrorist groups or other threatening groups. You're not causing proper long-term peace in that country. You're just signing a 5-year truce, which would, of course, lead to, in the long term, far, far more deaths. Finally, you say that the aim of the Kosovo expedition, the Yugoslavia intervention, was not to pacify relations and make amends between Serbia and Kosovo, but simply to save lives. But reconciliation between these two countries is needed to save lives. As I've already said, as long as the two countries are enemies, you are not signing a peace between them. You're signing a 20-year truce. It's a time bomb now. You must do something more fundamental, more core, which changes the country in a good and meaningful way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joseph. So now we're moving on to closing statements, first from Archie.
Thank you, Yazoo. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to briefly rebut Joseph's points, which he's just given us, before I move on to summarizing my main point. So Joseph's first and primary point in his last statement was about how pulling out of an intervention and an increased chance of pulling out of an intervention does change the moral value of the intervention. Now, I think that Joseph is talking about here, I think he's talking about things like the invasion of Iraq. And that was an unsuccessful foreign intervention. And unsuccessful foreign interventions have a pattern of being invasions rather than being something which just stops loss of life by damaging a force which is committing genocide. And I think that amends clearly need to be made to the way in which international intervention is carried out. And I think that this is one of them, actually. And I think that Joseph's touched upon a very important point here. But I don't think that's a reason to stop foreign intervention as an entity, because, and this brings me on to Joseph's next point, which is about we need better sanctions, because sanctioning a country is taking action against a government, but it does not necessarily immediately guarantee that people's lives are going to not be lost. And I think that in a case of thousands or millions of lives being lost, I think that sanctions, even if the sanctions are very powerful and will have a very large effect upon the country, if they don't have an effect, then I think that international intervention should not be ruled out. And I think that, and that's another reason why invasion is not so good, because having better sanctions because invasion is a move against a government rather than a move to save lots of lives. And having sanctions against the government will often stop that government from doing what it is that they are doing. lastly, I'd just like to say that intervention. So Joseph said that intervention does not cause peace, and he used the example of Kosovo and Serbia again. He said that unless they stop being enemies, loss of life is simply delayed, and that's not true. And as for the first sort of half of that point, intervention does not cause peace, was his point. And intervention is not, in the case of Yugoslavia, the intervention was not meant to cause peace. The intervention was meant to save lives. And the saving lives meant that there was enough time for the, entities such as the United Nations and diplomatic powers all around the world to try and help Yugoslavia to stop what was going on in their country. And that did result in the breakup of Yugoslavia. But the intervention is not meant to cause peace. It's meant to delay or stop the loss of life so that the diplomatic sort of treaties, and that's the important bit, can come into action with less urgency. They can be more thorough, and also it means that they can quickly stop the loss of life. And then with Kosovo and Serbia, the loss of life is simply delayed. That's not true, because in the case of Yugoslavia, Serbia was a dominant power, and the intervention in Yugoslavia gave the diplomats, as I've just said, enough time to stop what was going on there using diplomatic tools rather than the military. But it also stopped millions of lives by using the military to bomb the Serbian forces. So I'm just going to quickly wrap up by summarizing my one main point today, which was that loss of life is a morally very important thing, because one human being, and also many human beings, are a very high moral entity, and they should be treated in that way. And there should be, if all else fails, if the only way that loss of life can be prevented is to militarily intervene in a country, and by that I do not mean invade, I mean intervene, that is when military intervention is justified. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Archie. And to wrap up our debate, we'll have one last closing statement from Joe.
Thank you. I'm going to first rebut your rebuttal by, you said that invasion is not how you want to intervene. But how else are you going to intervene? Are you going to stand outside the country's border with a sign? There is no way to militarily intervene in a country without being in that country with your soldiers and therefore invading it. Secondly, as you say, the Yugoslavian expedition did not save lives and did not even delay the saving of lives. It killed a significant amount of people, that is to say, a good amount of the soldiers who were involved. But it did not do anything to resolve the underlying political tensions. So all you've done is delayed the mass killing by a while at the cost of some minor killing, which is still, as you have said, terrible, as humans are a high moral entity. Next, we need to talk about the cost of delaying these things. You say that to delay a war is better because it gives other nations time to react. But this delay comes at a cost. It is not a free delay. It costs the lives of the soldiers on both sides who are involved in the war, as well as the lives of many innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. Yes, it never works. So, in conclusion, we've talked about a significant amount of points, I have at least. So first we have the Kellogg-Briand Pact. It is illegal in most cases to intervene. And secondly, even if you do intervene, it will most likely, as we've talked about, be a catastrophe. And even if it is a success, democracy will cause a new leader to be elected, and chances are that he or her will pull out troops, leading to it again being a catastrophe, leaving a huge power vacuum. And even if troops are pulled out at the right time, and all is done well, nothing is done to resolve the long-term tensions, and therefore, at the very best, you have, at significant human cost, delayed the next war by 20 or so years. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Joseph. This wraps up our debate today. So if you'd like to see more posts, go onto our website, AnalyticaHP.com. And if you really like them, then consider buying a subscription to help support us and get access to exclusive posts. And links are all in this description. So thank you, everyone.